Hello and welcome back. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Tim and I'm a composer, hence Tim the Composer's podcast. Have a listen to episode 0 to find out what this podcast is all about. Perhaps you already have. So maybe just keep listening and we'll dive right in. Previously on this podcast, we've looked at Beethoven's First Symphony. That was the first episode. That's from 1800. And then we looked at Johann Sebastian Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier in the second episode. And that was from around 1720. But I promised in episode 0 that this podcast covers an entire millennium, 1,000 years of music, not just 1 or 2 centuries, which are, by comparison, I suppose, quite recent. Today, I want to go right back to the start of these 1,000 years, to the moment when one person came up with a way to write music down such that other people, long after the music had been written down, could reconstruct it more or less precisely. I want to tell you about Guido d'Arezzo. Now, Guido d'Arezzo lived from around 991 AD to 1033, so about 1,000 years ago. Guido was arguably the single most important figure in making Western musical notation practical and teachable. Therefore, from the point of view of this podcast, it's really the very beginning of it all. When music starts to be reliably written down, and that notation reliably and quickly taught to others, well, that's when the entire literate art of music begins. It's similar to writing, that is, of writing of words, and writing has been around for much, much longer than writing down of music. As a system, words or musical notation must be capable of being easily taught, and it must be capable of capturing the words or music such that someone else can understand or reproduce the original. Sometimes the key to understanding a form of notation can be lost. For example, we have very little to go on when it comes to understanding and to reproducing the sound of what Egyptian hieroglyphs represent. We have this amazing stone, which you may have seen, called the Rosetta Stone, which provides a small section of Egyptian hieroglyphs translated into Greek. But we don't know what the speech of the hieroglyphs sounded like, even if we can tell what they mean from seeing the Greek translation. However, with music, thanks to the system created by Guido d'Arezzo, who I'm going to tell you about today, and the fact that it is quite easily taught and therefore easy to pass on down the centuries, it's still around, and we can hear more or less exactly what Guido and the people of the 10th and 11th centuries intended when they wrote music down. It's a bit like, I suppose, a kind of a time capsule, perhaps. And I think this is particularly remarkable. You can look at a drawing or painting or tapestry, I suppose, and this is before the Norman conquest of England, for example, before 1066, but suppose we look at the Bayeux tapestry, which depicts the Battle of Hastings in 1066. We can get some idea of what the people could see at that time, maybe some idea of the clothing they wore, their hairstyles perhaps, the coats of arms, but it's not anything like a photo or a film, is it? We can read the words in the Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror, but we can't tell really how they were pronounced, for example. Yet we can sing the music written down using Guido's system shortly before 1066, and we can hear pretty much exactly what the people of the time heard. It really is a window into the past, this time capsule I mentioned. So let's understand what Guido was up to. Why did he come up with this system in the first place? What was the need? What was the point of doing it? Music, after all, had been around for probably thousands of years before Guido. Probably, I'm sure, as long as there have been humans and things to bang into other things, for example, there's been some kind of music. So what problem was Guido trying to solve with this system that he created? So before Guido, there were some systems for writing down music, but this notation was really quite vague. Early musical symbols, which were called neumes, they showed the general shape of melodies, whether notes went up or down, for example, but they couldn't specify, or these neumes didn't specify exact pitches or exact intervals, that is, the gap between notes. This made it very hard to teach music accurately and almost impossible to ensure consistency across different locations and across really any significant expanse of time, between lifetimes, for example. Think of it a bit like a recipe, maybe a baking recipe. And we all know that those are the most particular when it comes to getting the quantities right in order to ensure a successful cake or loaf of bread at the end of it. Much more a science than an art. Anyway, well, if a recipe says it needs some flour, some eggs, some salt, some yeast, and some sugar, followed by some water, but it doesn't give you the precise quantities required. Perhaps it does give you the order in which to add one substance to another, but the exact quantities, well, you'll have to guess how much to put in. You can make some crazy guesses, a ton of flour and one egg or something like that. Or you can make some educated guesses based on hand-me-down knowledge, based on having seen someone else do it before, perhaps, or based from your own previous attempts. Now, similarly, if the recipe then says some heat is required, but not how much or for how long, you'll have to estimate it for yourself. And when you've finished, assuming you end up with something edible and not a sort of a blackened rock, then how can you know that you ended up with what the recipe writer intended that you end up with? There's no real way of knowing. Musical notation before Guido was a little bit like that. Now, after Guido, precise quantities of each substance in the recipe were included in musical recipes. It took a bit longer, but things like timing, let's say rhythm, and temperature, let's say that's dynamics, loud and soft, they were added to the system after that. So we could have a complete system of describing music. And not only that, but the recipe writing and recipe reading system that Guido invented was simple to learn. Perhaps that's unlike baking, I don't know. Easy to learn anyway. So within a short time, it was possible to reconstruct a piece of music very closely from a great distance in either space, the other side of Europe, for example, or time, 100, 200, or even 1,000 years later. In fact, you could say we've come almost too far. Certainly by the 19th century, the 20th century, and today, the musical scores, that is, the musical books where music is written down, they're treated almost like biblical sources of absolute truth, rather than anything like a recipe that has room for personal, interpretation or reinterpretation. Now, I'm sure we'll return to that particular interesting topic another time, but it's a long way from Guido d'Arezzo's challenge in the early 11th century. Now, I'll come to exactly what Guido invented and why it was such a big success, and who Guido was exactly, what his life was like. But first, let's look at exactly why music needed to be reliably written down. After all, if humans had been making music just fine for hundreds, thousands of years, why the sudden need to write it down reliably? Why was the problem that Guido Arezzo solved a problem at all? Now, we'll have to rewind back further in time to understand this problem. Back in time to the turn of the 7th century, around about the year 600 AD. The Pope at this time was Pope Gregory, known as Gregory the Great, Saint Gregory, and much later as Pope Gregory the First. He is associated with a legend written down by the English monk John the Deacon, which goes as follows. The legend is that Gregory wrote a book of antiphons. Now, antiphons, that means music, specifically chant, sung by choirs as part of the church liturgy, which in turn, that liturgy means music required for various different services at different times of the day and year. Anyway, and that Gregory founded a schola, meaning a choir, in Rome, which performed the chant according to Gregory's instruction. Furthermore, that he constructed 2 purpose-built places for music in Rome, at St. Peter's and at the Lateran Palace, from which he, Gregory, gave lessons in music from his book, The Authentic Antiphona. The Authentic Antiphona is the great book containing all the music for the entire liturgical calendar. Furthermore, that Gregory received the music that he set down in this great book from divine origins, the voice of God, communicated to Gregory through the voice of a dove. Therefore, in paintings of St. Gregory, you usually see a dove, typically with its head in Gregory's mouth. Now, this particular part of the legend of St. Gregory comes from the story of a scribe who was responsible for writing down Gregory's commentaries on the Bible, his sermons, in other words. Now, the scribe was separated from Gregory while he was doing this job by a screen, and at one point, Gregory fell silent. The scribe, thinking that something was wrong, looked through the screen and saw the dove of the Holy Spirit at the head of St. Gregory, who then resumed his commentary only after the dove had removed its beak from Gregory's mouth. How bizarre. Now, the illuminated manuscript copies of Gregory's sermons therefore show Gregory with this dove. And guess what? We still maintain this tradition today, for it's where the phrase, "a little bird told me," comes from. So I hear it is anyway. And it's for this reason that the chant used in later centuries is known as Gregorian chant, because it comes from Gregory. The very earliest books of chant usually contained an inscription at the start, such as "Gregory composed this book of musical art of the singer's choir," in Latin, of course, not in English, further suggesting that it all came from St. Gregory. So it's a wonderful, colourful story. Unfortunately, it's also impossible for it to be true, not just because of doves telling people how to write music, but it's a story from the 9th century. Now, if you remember, I said that the legend was written down by John the Deacon, and he did so in the 9th century. Back in the year 600, when Gregory is supposed to have done this, there was no way at all to set down music in writing. So this great authentic antiphona book, supposed to have been written down by Gregory, could not have contained any notated music. We know this is the case, for example, as according to Saint Isidore, who is Bishop of Seville, who wrote in around 630 AD in his Encyclopedia Etymologiae, which means origins. He wrote in this book, "Unless sounds are held in the memory by man, they perish because they cannot be written down." So that's in 630. So why was John the Deacon, 250 years later, saying something different? Well, it comes down to a mixture of politics, military might, and the Christian faith, powerful forces that not for the first or for the last time shaped and reshaped European culture. By the year 750, so more than a century after St. Gregory did or actually did not write this book down, year 750, Rome was a shadow of its former glory. The Roman Empire had long since fractured into two. What was left of the western half of the Roman Empire was under threat from various so-called barbarian tribes and minor kingdoms. The last Roman emperor had been deposed some 3 centuries earlier by a barbarian general in 476. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, meanwhile, had prospered, although by now it was under serious threat also from Islam and from Arab conquests. In the remains of the Western Empire, one tribe of barbarians, or more precisely the Lombards, who were a Germanic tribe, they had entered into the northern part of modern Italy and had taken the city of Ravenna, only around 350 kilometres from Rome itself. Visigoths had taken much of Gaul, but had been driven to the fringes by the Franks and their Merovingian dynasty of kings, who had converted to Christianity. The Arabs, in the form of the Umayyad Caliphate, had also entered the Western Empire through Spain, conquering the whole of modern-day Spain, and then invaded France until they were famously defeated at the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, by Charles Martel, who was the ruler of the Franks in 732. So, in 750, Pope Stephen II, who was the Pope at that time, crossed the Alps with a large retinue of cardinals and bishops to visit the king of the Franks, who by now, thanks to the conquests of Charles Martel, the Franks were the rulers of a large territory comprising most of modern-day France, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, along with parts of Slovenia, Croatia, the Czech Republic, and some small territories in modern Italy. Now, the new king of the Franks, at the time Pope Stephen went there in 750, was Pepin III, who was the son of Charles Martel. But Pepin III was known in his day because then, in those days, kings were not counted with regnal numbers, the first, the second, the third, and so on, but they were given nicknames to tell apart different kings with the same name. So Pepin III was known as Pepin the Short, or Pepin le Bref. Now, this is true of his father, Charles Martel, too. Martel wasn't his surname. Martel is the old French word for hammer. So bear in mind that this nickname, the Short, for Pepin the Short, this nickname was added later, perhaps centuries later. It was a way of distinguishing one Pepin from another. There is no evidence, it seems, but perhaps you can resolve this mystery. I've not been able to find any evidence or any sign of it, of this particular Pepin III actually being short, so nor did he reign for a particularly short time. nor is there any evidence that perhaps the short means that he didn't speak very much or he was very slightly curt or rude in his speaking. No idea really why he was called the Short then. Bit of a historical mystery for you. Perhaps you can investigate and see what you can find out and let me know. Back to the story. Pope Stephen came all the way across the Alps to ask Pepin to honour an earlier promise by the Frankish kings to defend Rome. Pepin agreed to honour the pact and to send an army to Italy. Both Stephen and Pepin then went to the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, which was then to the north of Paris, but today is well within the Paris metropolitan area. And the Pope declared Pepin and all of his heirs to be honorary patricians of Rome, recognising Pepin and his heirs as the legitimate and hereditary rulers of the Franks. This marked the start of the Carolingian dynasty, replacing the previous Merovingian dynasty, and it became the most powerful ruling family in Europe for at least 200 years that followed. It's named Carolingian, by the way, after Pepin's father, Charles Martel, and Pepin's son, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who in fact became emperor of the newly christened Carolingian Empire, and was crowned as such by another pope, Leo III, in Rome itself. Charlemagne was largely responsible for the continued spread of Christianity throughout Europe, most of which he unified in the Carolingian Empire. So, you can see that this pact, or alliance, between the church in Rome and the military and political might of the Franks of the Carolingians was a huge benefit to both. But we're still not up to the time of our main subject, Guido d'Arezzo, for Charlemagne died in 814, so we're still 150 years off from Guido's time. Right, the grand project of the Franks, the Carolingians, was to unite a large empire in which there were many individual cultures and a good number of different languages in use. For them, Christianity was a powerful and useful unifying force, as local rulers were keen to secure their place in the afterlife. Now, for the Pope in Rome, the rapid spread of Christianity was clearly desirable, so as a mutually beneficial arrangement, it was extremely effective. Christendom, as it came to be called, operated as a kind of parallel state and power structure, and the church was often there when the state failed, for example, acting as healers or providing homes for orphans, helping the destitute, and so on. But for the Pope in Rome, merely being a so-called Christian wasn't sufficient. There were several flavours and traditions competing with the Roman liturgy. Likewise, it was important to the Carolingians that Christian practice in every part of this sprawling empire should be the same, centralising divine power in a similar way to how they centralised military and legal power. And the music used in Christian services, the multi-year liturgy, the Roman chant, was essential to this. The texts could be made uniform because they're written down in Latin, but what was the equivalent of Latin texts for music? For example, here's a decree made by Charlemagne. Remember, it's Charles the Great, the son of Pepin the Short, in 789. He's talking here about the Gallican rite as distinct from the Roman rite. That is, two different versions of the church liturgy. So here he goes. This is what he says. Translated, of course, into English because maybe you can understand Latin, but I'm not going to speak Latin to you. Anyway, translated. As King Pepin, our parent of blessed memory, once decreed that the Gallican be abolished, be sure to amend carefully in every monastery and bishop's house the psalms, notes, chants, calendar material, grammars, and the epistles and gospels. For often enough there are those who want to call upon God well, but because of poor texts, they do it poorly. So these texts, mentioned by Charlemagne, were texts that were intended to be sung, because one does not call upon God in the common voice one uses to speak to your fellow man, or indeed to record a podcast. After all, don't worry, I'm not going to suddenly start singing my podcast to you. You wouldn't enjoy that very much. There were various systems available, but it was an inconsistent picture. None of the systems could reliably transmit the correct music across the expanse of Christendom, nor across years, decades, centuries. Nothing like as effective as the written Latin script, tirelessly copied out by monks. It took a long time to train the singers in monasteries, to train to sing all of the music that was needed, and it needed to be memorized. The basic forms of notation available, it did little more than really say whether the pitch would rise or fall, as I mentioned earlier, but not by how much, not really providing any rhythmic information other than the rhythm of the words. Specialists, called cantors, who memorized music, They were sent from Rome to teach the chant by rote across the Frankish lands. But this, as you might imagine, was difficult, it was time-consuming, and it met with some resistance, it seems. There was something of a blame game that went on. For example, the English monk who I mentioned earlier, John the Deacon, he was working for Rome in 875. He claimed that the northerners, i.e. north of Rome, not north of England, they were crude and base barbarians, incapable of learning. But another monk, a Frankish one, who was called Notka the Stammerer, blamed the southerners, i.e. the Romans, for their pride and dishonesty. Now Notka the Stammerer, he was also known as Notka Balbulus. He's a particularly interesting figure in this story. He had, apparently, a pronounced stutter, hence his name, the Stammerer, but he's more fairly remembered for two important books. One was a biography of Charlemagne, and the other was essentially a musical composition called the Liber Hymnorum. The earliest surviving examples of this book date from around the time of Notka's death in 912, so still around a century before Guido d'Arezzo. Now this book seems to have been completed earlier than 912, in around 884. In this book, Notka sets a collection of texts, organised according to the church calendar, to melodies. He was inspired by an earlier chants book that he had access to, which had also included little markings to indicate the correct melody. Now, in the preface to the Liber Hymnorum, Notka recalls the difficulty he had as a child trying to learn melodies by heart. He called them melodiae longissimae, very long melodies. Now, specifically, he means the final R of Alleluia, which is also called the Jubilus, because in general, all the other words were sung with one note to one syllable. But that final R of Alleluia, on the other hand, that would take a sequence of many notes. Now, the technical word for many notes to one syllable is a melisma. But this melisma on the final R of Alleluia was a very long sequence of notes and always had to be memorized. Now, if you have a look at Notka's book, you can find an image, Google image search, something like that, of an early copy, not a later edition that uses modern notation, but find an earlier one, then you might be able to see the problem straight away. There are marks above the words, little dashes and dots that rise and fall. They look a little bit like Arabic script, although not as complex and not joined together in something like words. But there's no indication of the correct starting pitch, or by how far exactly one should rise and fall when singing the words, but you can follow a rising and falling line perhaps. There's also no indication of exactly how long each note should be, only a general idea of some perhaps being longer than others. So if you already know the chant, because you were taught it by a cantor, or perhaps by Notka himself, then the markings, if you already know the chant, the markings called neumes, they would be very helpful in remembering the melody, if you already know it. But, importantly, you cannot construct the melody from these markings on their own. It's a crucial point. The neumes, therefore, these little markings, in the 9th century, they were the main way of helping to remember the correct melodies for the Roman chant. The word neume comes, interestingly, from ancient Greek, but from two different words. Pneuma, N-E-U-M-A, meaning sign, and pneuma, there's a silent P there, P-N-E-U-M-A, meaning breath. Now we see that today in words like pneumatic, meaning powered by air, or pneumonia, an infection of the lungs. So this word neumes, sort of a pun perhaps, breath, signs. Anyway, I wonder why exactly they're written as they are. Some people say these neumes are representations of the hand movements of cantors who taught melodies. Now, that seems very plausible to me, and choir directors use similar hand gestures that rise and fall or indicate strong notes or held notes, all that kind of thing, to this very day. If you watch a choir singing from memory and then you watch their director, you'll see all kinds of hand movements. It's quite a different set of hand movements than you would see from a conductor of an orchestra. Now, I've also read that there is a Byzantine influence on this form of notation of neumes. Some take the view that it originated in the East and was indeed heavily influenced by the system of notation used in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. So when I see similarities to Arabic script in these markings, I'm not the only one to see that. Right, by the 9th century, therefore, we have a system of writing down something to help remember music that you have already been taught, but still no system for reading or reproducing music in the same way as you can read text, to construct the correct forms without anyone to teach you. For example, I can read directly from Notke's book, the Latin text, Christus hunc diem iocundum cunctis concedat esse Christianis amatoribus suis. And this is perhaps more or less exactly how a monk in the 9th century would read it to you. Now, I can also see the little neumes Notke has placed above the words to indicate his melody, but really, I cannot reconstruct his melody in at all the same way that I can read the Latin. Really, I can't construct the melody at all. I can only guess at an approximation based on things like tradition, and hearing other people perform it, or perhaps figuring out my own melody that rises and falls according to the little lines shown. But I can't produce exactly what Notke had in his mind. One little mystery to solve that you might be wondering about: why was this called Gregorian chant, when, as you know by now, St. Gregory, the original Pope Gregory I, cannot possibly have written down the Roman chant, given that even Notke, nearly 500 years after Pope Gregory I, could not write it down in an easily transmissible form either? Now, the answer is simply that the Roman chant was credited to St. Gregory as a way of giving it credibility, weight, authenticity, a sense of historical tradition. This was essentially a once-upon-a-time story attached to the Roman chant, to give it the same sense of belonging to the Roman rite as the Latin texts. The story, as told by monks and cantors in the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Roman rite was spread throughout the Carolingian Empire and all of Christendom, was that this music, the one true chant to accompany the one true liturgy, came directly from God through the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove to Saint Gregory, preserved by him in Rome hundreds of years ago, and coming to you directly from him. Saint Gregory wrote it down as told to him by the dove. We cantors have memorized it, and you must now memorize it in turn. Now, this story isn't exactly true. As we know, Gregory cannot possibly have written it down as a system of faithful reproduction of music. It didn't exist. There wasn't a system. But it was a very useful story nonetheless. And so even today, we call this chant Gregorian chant, rather than, for example, Carolingian chant. Now, this brings us to the situation at the start of the 11th century and the time of Guido d'Arezzo. For Guido, just as for Notke, learning all this music was tedious and time-consuming. Guido had the job of teaching the chant, so he was a cantor, to other monks, and he complained bitterly that it took him 10 years per student to teach it all. It's a huge amount of time. Now, I'll tell you a bit about Guido's life, so that you can appreciate why he might have strongly wanted to develop a better system, even aside from the length of time required to teach music. Guido was born around 991, at the end of the 10th century, as far as we know, somewhere in northern Italy. This would have been around the time of another Pope Gregory, this time Gregory V, who was actually the first German Pope. Guido's early career as a young Benedictine monk began around 1013 at Pomposa Abbey near Ravenna, northern Italy. You might remember it from earlier in the story, the same Ravenna that was taken by the Lombards and had to be liberated by Pepin the Short. The abbey, which was founded around the year 600, during the time the Lombards controlled this part of Italy, was founded by an Irish monk, St. Columbanus, and became, in the following centuries, an important repository of Carolingian manuscripts. It's close by the Adriatic Sea. It's to the south of Venice, east of Ferrara, and north of Ravenna. It's still there to this very day. You can go and visit it. We don't know much about Guido before he arrived at Pomposa Abbey, unfortunately, and due to his subsequent fame, perhaps there are rival claims for his precise birthplace. One claim is Arezzo itself, as you might expect, but the d'Arezzo that we know him today is likely because he did his most important work, perhaps some time after his birth, at Arezzo. On the other hand, I've seen some quite recent research that suggests Guido began life at Arezzo, was ordained as a subdeacon, and importantly, trained as a cantor, that is, trained as one of those whose job it was to teach the chant. But it was at Pomposa Abbey where Guido first developed his revolutionary ideas. He clearly became somewhat frustrated with the existing system of teaching and thought he could do better. Why did he start thinking along these lines? Well, we can only imagine, but even today, I think we can sympathise completely with arriving at a new workplace as a young, new employee early in our career, perhaps. And maybe we've arrived at this workplace. The more senior people are all older, they're set in their ways. We arrive there. We can see that there's surely a better way to do things than what's being done right now. Surely there's a better way. This is a crazy way of doing things. And sometimes we take matters into our own hands and we start trying to do things in a better way, coming up with new systems. And I reckon this is exactly what happened with Guido. However it happened, his first innovation was to place pitches onto a staff, also called a stave. That's a collection of horizontal lines. There were 4 in Guido's early system. There are actually 5 in the staff that we have today. Now, pitches were represented as marks, and when placed on a higher line in the staff, the pitch was higher, and vice versa for lower pitches, placed on a lower line on the staff. The main difference to the earlier system, therefore, is that you have an immediate visual indication of how much higher or lower a pitch is compared to others in the same melody, so you can reproduce it accurately. But as might be expected of a newbie arriving at a place of work, creating havoc, trying to get everyone to change their ways, his newfangled ideas created controversy. Some of the older monks resented his approach, his new methods, saw them as needless departures from tradition. Now this tradition, remember, has been alive for centuries now. 500 years after the time of St. Gregory, 200 years since Pope Stephen crossed the Alps to make a deal with Pepin the Short. The conflict at Pomposa Abbey between Guido and the traditionalists became so intense that he was essentially forced to leave the abbey. He was kicked out. Now the abbot at Pomposa sent Guido to Arezzo, possibly back to Arezzo, if that's where he came from in the first place. Somewhat confusingly, the abbot at Pomposa Abbey was also called Guido, but anyway, Abbot Guido sent monk Guido away to the cathedral at Arezzo, where there was a cathedral school and no monastery. Abbot Guido knew the bishop at Arezzo, who was called Tedald, and knew that he might be a bit more open-minded. Or perhaps it was a case of more like, you can have this troublemaker back. Don't want him. In any case, Guido's colleagues at the cathedral school were much more receptive. Bishop Tedald supported his work, gave him the freedom to develop and refine his system. Now here, at the cathedral school, Guido began work on the book for which he is best remembered, his Micrologos, or Little Treatise. The full title is Micrologos Guidonis de Disciplina Artis Musicae, or Guido's Little Treatise on the Discipline of the Musical Art. Doesn't sound a very controversial title, but perhaps it was. And this book is dedicated to Bishop Tedald. It was completed in around 1025. This book, this Micrologos, contains much material on the subject of chant, approaches to teaching it, including the innovations for which Guido is best remembered, and which transformed the way music spread and developed from then on. Now I'll come to those in a moment. A bit more about Guido's life. Guido's reputation grew so much that the Pope, who was the Pope John the 19th by now, summoned him to Rome around 1028 to demonstrate his teaching methods. The papal court was impressed, and there was great interest among the clergy, but sadly Guido became ill, and he prepared to leave again for the countryside to try and recover. Now at this moment, Abbot Guido, remember him, approached monk Guido. Perhaps he regretted his part in driving monk Guido away from Pomposa and suggested that he come back there. Come back, all is forgiven, especially now that you're famous and favoured by the Pope. And it seems that monk Guido didn't take up this kind offer and spent his remaining few years at another monastery near Arezzo with a Camaldolese order of Benedictine monks. Now these monks emphasized a solitary life. Each monk lived apart, almost like a hermit, in the Tuscan hills. Now here, if indeed this is where Guido ended up, he spent his remaining years passing away in or soon after the year 1033, which is the date of the last document ever to mention him during his lifetime. Today, we remember Guido, however, for his innovations. I've already mentioned the stave or staff, which allows pitches to be placed accurately relative to one another. But which pitches exactly? Now, Guido described 6 notes or pitches known as the hexachord. Here they are. As you can hear, this is most of a typical major scale, as we call it today. In order to describe these notes, Guido gave them names: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Now, why these names in particular? In order to help students remember them, he used an 8th century prayer written by Paul the deacon, Paulus Diakonos, an earlier Benedictine monk, and also a historian of the Lombards. This prayer to John the Baptist, when sung, begins each line on a successive note of the hexachord, the 6-note scale, and the lines of the prayer are ut queant laxis, resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labi reatum, sancte Johannes. Now you can hear then that each of the lines begins with a syllable, and that syllable is what Guido used to name each note of the hexachord. It's thought that Guido composed a melody too that goes with this, but he may have repurposed an existing melody. Nonetheless, it is Guido that is associated with it now, and I'll play you the chant that he used, and it goes like this. Now you'll hear that the first note of each phrase is a note in the scale, so I'll play it. It's easy to understand if I play it. So here we go. Ut queant laxis goes like this. Resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labi reatum. And then Sancte Johannes, Saint John. Okay, so I'll play it all in one go, and I'll hold down the first note of each phrase so you can hear the scale more clearly. Okay, you can hear then that each of the lines begins with a syllable that Guido used to name each note of the hexachord, or the 6-note scale. The Latin text, the ut queant laxis, now it can be translated into sort of modern English like this: so that your servants may with loosened voices resound the wonders of your deeds, clean the guilt from our stained lips, O Saint John. Now the names of these notes is probably a little bit familiar to you, especially if I tell you that later the first one, ut, so that all of them together, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Now that first one, ut, was later changed to do, so it became do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Now this change from ut to do, that happened because it was supposedly a more open sound, easier to sing, but this change didn't happen until the 17th century. It was introduced by an Italian music theorist, Giovanni Battista Doni. Now, he argued that do was easier to pronounce, easier to sing, and was also short for Dominus, the Latin word for the Lord. And by pure coincidence, I'm sure, Giovanni Battista Doni that do is the first syllable of Doni's name. Just a coincidence. A seventh syllable was added at around the same time. It was initially called Si, for the initials of St. John Sancti Johannes, but was finally changed to T in the 19th century by Sarah Glover, who was an English teacher of music, so that each syllable could begin with a different letter. And this is the final form that I'm sure you must have heard. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. And then the next one would be do again. Sounds familiar? It was made famous much more recently, well, more recently than the time of Guido, as the song Do a Dear, also called Do Re Mi, in the musical The Sound of Music, created in 1955 by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. Now, in that musical, Maria, who had been training to become a nun at an abbey but had to leave due to her controversial behaviour, became a governess and, importantly, a teacher of music to the Von Trapp family, which had 7 children, and she taught them the musical scale using the song Do, a deer, a female deer, Re, a drop of golden sun, Mi, a name, I call myself, and so on. Now, this might well sound familiar. I think Rodgers and Hammerstein knew the story of Guido d'Arezzo and left us some Easter eggs here. Maria was kicked out of an abbey for being unconventional. So was Guido. Maria ended up teaching music. So did Guido. And the Von Trapp name, maybe that's not a coincidence, that this sounds like an obvious connection to the Trappist monks who were related to the Benedictine order, of which Guido was a member. It's also surely a bit of a joke. The Trappist monks are perhaps best known, apart from their famous beer, for speaking only when absolutely necessary. Hence perhaps the origin of the phrase today, shut your trap, to be quiet. So what better to name a family that will be known for singing than after an order of monks known for their silence? But the biggest link to Guido is that Maria, in The Sound of Music, taught the Von Trapp children using a song that had the names of the notes as the first syllable of each line, do, a deer, and so on, in which the music for each of those lines begins on each successive note. So the first line begins on the note do and the word do. The second begins on the note re with the word re, and all the rest. And that's exactly what Guido did too with ut queant laxis. The first line starts with the word ut and the note therefore labelled by Guido ut. The second line starts with re, and so on. So I think Rodgers and Hammerstein had a good joke about this and left us these clues to connect them and pay a tribute to Guido d'Arezzo. And I like to imagine the old abbot at Pombosa, Abbot Guido, wondering to himself, how do you solve a problem like Arezzo? Something like that. Anyway, right, now we have the names for each of the pitches. We have a useful, memorable way to remember them. We have the staff onto which we can draw them. Guido added a clef or key to lock the pitches into place on the staff and tell us which line on the staff corresponds to ut. If most of the notes in your melody are above ut, then you place the clef lower down the staff on a lower line. So the notes above ut will be neatly written on the staff. But conversely, if most of your notes are below ut in your melody, then you would place the clef for where ut is higher on the staff, so that most of the notes can be below that. And this system went through various minor iterations over the centuries, and today we have most commonly the treble clef and the bass clef. You might have heard of these, especially if you're a musician, especially if you're a piano player, because you have to know both of them. The treble clef is a stylized letter G, and it tells you where the note G is on the stave. The bass clef is a stylized F, and as you can guess, it tells you where the note F is. Now you might be wondering why we call notes by letters A, B, C, and I've been talking about Guido using ut, later do, re, mi. Both systems are still in use today, depending on which country you're in. And the difference arose with ut, re, mi being associated with A, B, C at first in Germanic-speaking countries. So if your language is a Romance language, French or Italian for example, you'll typically use do, re, mi, and that's called the solfege system, or solfeggio in Italian. But if your language is Germanic, including English, then you'll use A, B, C. The letter name version had been in use long before Guido's time. Boethius, for example, in the 6th century used it. But the solfege system was the invention of Guido d'Arezzo. So it's called solfege or solfeggio simply because of sol and fa are two of the syllables named by Guido. Now, there's one more idea that Guido wrote about in his books, and there are plenty of ideas, but this is especially significant later in music, and this is the process of approaching what he called an accursus. Now, this is when two simultaneous lines in music reach the same note, called a unison. Now, that would happen typically at the end of a line. Accursus means meeting or concurrence on the same path, for example. Now, Guido describes in great detail the correct way to approach an accursus in two lines of music. The unison should be approached either from a third by contrary motion, where the lines move in opposite directions, towards or away from each other, or from a second by oblique motion, where one part remains on the same note and the other moves towards it. Now, that might sound a bit complicated, so I'll play it a bit for you. So approaching from a third sounds like this, and you have to approach the note in the middle. So the top line moves down, and the bottom line moves up. Here's a slightly longer example. So you can hear in that case, we have at the end of the line. So the second case, which is approaching a unison note or an accursus from a second sounds like this, with the two notes. And when you're at that point and you're approaching the unison, you have to keep one note the same and the other one joins it. So it sounds a bit like this. So you hear at the end it went. So the top line went, and the bottom line just stayed on to make. Okay, so that might not seem like such a big deal, but it sets out in a very basic way, the elementary way, the way in which dissonances are resolved, which then leads to bigger ideas about the way melody and harmony interact, ideas that are hugely important to later music theory, and of course the music created by subsequent generations of composers reading Guido's book. The process for a composer of first learning the rules, trying and then often failing to observe the rules in your early compositions, supervised by a teacher perhaps, and then breaking or bending the rules in creative ways while seeing what previous composers did, because they also broke the rules quite often. And that's the way music has developed for centuries since Guido. And indeed, Guido did exactly that, learning the way the chant had to be taught and then deciding to break the rules and invent his own system. He was a typical composer. Right, now lastly, as if all of that wasn't enough, another invention by Guido, an easy way to quickly dictate or teach music using solfège to a group of students or to a choir. It's known as the Guidonian hand, and it developed considerably a lot more after Guido, but he first described the idea in his work, in his book. The principle involves holding up your hand and indicating different joints by pointing at them, different joints on your hand by pointing at them. The joint that you're pointing at corresponds to a particular note. The choir can then simply watch your hand rather than trying to read notation if they're struggling to read. If you're particularly good at leading a choir this way, you can dictate 2 parts simultaneously using 2 hands, or 3 parts by using 2 hands and then mouthing the notes do, re, mi with your mouth. It sounds pretty difficult, but if it's what you do day in, day out, I expect you get good at it quite fast. So there we have it, the Guidonian hand. The names of the notes that correspond to the Ut quaent laxis poem as a mnemonic, the staff and clefs, all the ingredients needed to quickly and easily teach music efficiently. Guido himself claimed that he could bring down the time needed to train a cantor from 10 years to only 1 year. And I think, even more importantly, Guido's inventions allowed musicians to reconstruct a piece of music accurately without having to be taught how it sounds first. And this innovation allowed the literature of music to spread and develop because it can be reproduced accurately. It can be written and read accurately to be transmitted across great distances of time and space and become ever more complex for the next 10 centuries to the present day and beyond into the future. It's a remarkable legacy, and I think it's wonderful that we can trace it back to this one man and his dissatisfaction with the old, inefficient ways. Right, now to finish, I'll recommend some things to listen to. Now, I've started assembling a playlist for each episode on Spotify only for now, and you can search on Spotify Tim the Composer, and you should hopefully find them. So for this episode, I've included some Gregorian chant as composed by Notka the Stammerer, and some recordings of Guido's Ut Queant Laxis. I've also included the song Do Re Mi from The Sound of Music, performed by Julie Andrews, of course, because I'll take the chance any time to listen to that. Now, there's a huge amount of Gregorian chant to listen to, apart from my playlist, and you'll find lots from many centuries in all the streaming platforms. It's quite hard, honestly, to work out what comes from where, from what year, how authentic it is. We're talking about a chunk of music history probably around 500 years long. And ever since Gregorian chant became something to relax to in a completely secular and almost kind of ignorant way, with chart-topping hits and all the rest of it, there's been a lot of it around, recordings to listen to. Some of it a little on the dubious side, I think. Anyway, so I've put a few things on the Spotify playlist that illustrate the story I've told in this podcast. But for deeper listening, I would rather recommend something else. I would like to recommend to you a particular set of recordings not available on streaming platforms, and it's really one of the most remarkable recording products I've come across. So if you use your web browser and browse to neumes.com and have a look there. Now it's spelled slightly differently to how we normally spell Neumes, so it's spelled neumz.com, so neumz.com, neumes.com. The recordings there are made by the record label Odradek, and the performances are by two Benedictine abbeys in Provence in France. So they are the Abbé Notre-Dame de Fidélité à Jouques, now they are nuns, and the other one is the Abbé Sainte-Madeleine de Barou, and they are monks. Now, the project set out to record the entire Gregorian chant, covering every service in the entire liturgical cycle. That is, the entire material that Notka Balbulus and Guido and the other cantors all had to learn and teach. Now, I think listening to this and exploring it, you might appreciate even more what motivated someone like Guido to come up with a better system, because there's around 10,000 hours of material in these recordings. It's all available in an app, of course. They call it a Liber Digitalis, or Liber Digitalis, perhaps. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. And there is a free tier, so free to listen to. I wonder what Guido would have made of that. I mean, the app. But I wonder also what he would have made of the business side of music too. We have free tiers, subscriptions, and so on. Or how easy it is to transmit 10,000 hours of music to anyone in the world. Bearing in mind also that the world today is far bigger than anyone in Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries imagined, both in population and with the discovery of America still half a millennium in the future. Now, what's also great about this project, this neumes.com, this app, is that you can follow the music as it's being sung on staves of the exact kind that Guido pioneered. Though they look a little different to the modern stave of today. If you're a musician today, they'll look a bit different to you perhaps. For example, there are 4 lines, not 5, and the notes themselves are square, not round. And they've got a slightly different rhythmic system, but you should be able to follow along with this app very easily. Now, what's more, you can read the Neume version, that is, the kind that Notka Balbulus wrote in his Liber Hymnorum, above the stave, although unfortunately you need to pay to access that feature, but why not? It's a wonderful project, worth supporting. And of course, the Latin text is there too, so you can follow the Latin text, the notes using Guido's system, and the neumes using the same system that Notka used. So I think it's a great way to appreciate all the struggles and advances that I've talked about in this podcast. It might take you a while to listen to it all, so perhaps you can dip in and out. Take a moment of contemplation in your day. After all, it's built around a 4-year calendar cycle with 9 services per day, and the app enables you to find the exact chant that corresponds to the day and the time of the day that you're sitting down to listen. Just for fun, it also tells you the date in Latin. Okay, go and have a listen to Neumes.com or the Spotify playlist for this episode, and I'll go and work on the next Tim the Composer podcast. So I hope you'll join me then for another adventure into this 1,000 years of music. Bye for now.